Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're plunging, head first really, into a mystery from the past. A true crime story that just completely baffled investigators nearly a century ago.
And it still does, doesn't it? It continues to puzzle us.
Absolutely. It's got this nickname, the Impossible Murder, and, well, as you'll hear, there's a very good reason for that. Our mission today is to sort of unpack the case of Julia Wallace. This was a murder back in 1931 in England.
And it led to a really controversial trial, yeah. And actually a first in English legal history.
That's right. You'll hear about this, very unassuming couple, a really bizarre phone call, and a timeline that is just so impossibly tight, it forces you to question, well, everything you think you know about evidence.
It's quite striking, actually, how the facts of this case, if you just take them at face value, they present an almost physically impossible scenario for the man who was convicted to have actually committed the crime. And this isn't just, a confusing detail. It's a stark reminder of how evidence that seems rock solid can be, undermined by the sheer logic of time and space. It really forces you to question the very basis of a conviction. And it makes you ask, if it wasn't him, then who could it have been?
That's a really powerful observation. The public, they seemed convinced. But the evidence, or maybe the lack of it, told a totally different story. So let's begin by setting the scene for this really enduring mystery, laying out the quiet life that was, so violently interrupted. Right, so our story takes us to Liverpool, 1931. We're focusing on William Herbert Wallace. He was 52, an insurance agent for Prudential. By all accounts, Wallace lived what, most people would call a pretty quiet life, almost unremarkable, really, with his wife, Julia. They lived at 29 Wolverton Street in the Enfield district. Neighbors described them as, a loving couple who mostly kept to themselves. Julia, she sounds quite talented, actually. An accomplished pianist, a watercolor artist, spoke French fluently.
Yeah, cultured literary taste, too, apparently.
Right. And William, while he was intellectual, he was seen as maybe a bit fussy, sometimes pedantic, but he dabbled in science, philosophy, even took up violin lessons age 50. Presumably so he could try and play music with Julia.
That's quite sweet, in a way.
Yeah, they seemed to enjoy trips out, the cinema sometimes. Their routine just seemed completely set in stone.
And if you zoom out, their life just appeared utterly conventional, which of course makes what happened next all the more jarring. They'd lived at the same place for 15 years, and no neighbors ever reported any tension, no arguments, no discord between them.
They seemed perfectly content.
Exactly. And that very normalcy just deepens the mystery of what unfolded.
And here's where things start getting really interesting, where the theories begin. William Wallace had this one standout hobby: chess.
Ah, yes, the chess club.
He was a dedicated player, even played in local championship competitions. And it was actually a chess match on Monday, January 19th, 1931, that sort of marked the beginning of the end for this quiet couple. Wallace had just arrived, settled in for his championship match, when he was flagged down by the venue's owner. Apparently, about half an hour before Wallace got there, the owner had taken a phone call. The caller had a strong, gruff voice, according to the owner. And instead of offering to call back later, this caller specifically wanted Wallace to meet him the next evening, Tuesday, around 7:30 p.m., at Wallace's home.
That's specific, very specific.
Extremely. The caller gave his name as R.M. Qualtro, we'll just call him Q, and gave an address, 25 Menlove Gardens East in Mossley Hill. He said he needed insurance for his daughter, who had just turned 21. It was supposedly her birthday that very day, which was his excuse for not being able to call back later.
The details sound almost too precise, too convenient maybe.
That's what Wallace thought too. He immediately said the name and address meant nothing to him. And nobody else at the chess club recognized them either.
Right. And this seemingly small detail becomes absolutely critical as the story unfolds. It really suggests a deliberate setup, doesn't it?
Definitely feels that way. So the next day, Tuesday, January 20th, 1931. It seemed like just another ordinary Tuesday for William Wallace. He did his usual rounds, collecting insurance money from clients. This was between about 3:43 p.m. and 5:45 p.m.
And people saw him.
Yes. According to those he visited that afternoon, he seemed completely normal. He even cracked a few jokes, had tea with one client. No sign at all that anything was wrong. Once he finished his rounds, he presumably went straight home, which would put him back at Wolverton Street around 6:00 p.m. Now, crucially, sometime between 6:40 and 6:45 p.m., a local milk boy stopped by the Wallace house. He was there to collect the weekly dues from Julia.
And this confirms she was alive and well at that point.
Exactly. Alive, well, going about her usual evening routine.
And what really stands out here, again, is the timing. The precise timing of that milk boy's visit. This isn't just some minor detail. As we'll see, a difference of just a few minutes in this period becomes the absolute linchpin of the entire prosecution's case. It creates this incredibly narrow window for what happened next.
Right, so fast forward a bit. Around 7:10 p.m., Wallace is spotted. He's about 20 minutes away from his house, heading towards the tram line. He's setting off on his journey to find this Mr. Q at Menlove Gardens East.
The address that didn't exist.
The address that didn't exist. And because Wallace wasn't familiar with that area, Mossley Hill, he was apparently badgering everyone he could find for directions. Tram operators, policemen.
Leaving a trail of witnesses to his search.
You could say that. He was definitely diligent in trying to find this elusive client. But as you said, the immediate problem was there was a Menlove Avenue. There were Menlove Gardens west, south, and north.
But no east.
No Menlove Gardens east. Some people he asked told him this directly. Others just sort of assumed it must be near the other Menlove locations and pointed in vaguely in that direction.
Yeah, and that detail is just pivotal, isn't it? It strongly suggests the address was either completely made up or it was a deliberate misdirection. Something designed specifically to lure Wallace away from his home for a certain amount of time. His very public, persistent search for a non-existent address just adds another really perplexing layer.
Totally. So by 8:20 p.m., he's getting frustrated. The search has clearly been fruitless. Wallace decides to just turn back, give up on finding this potential client. The next update we get is from Wallace's next-door neighbors, the people at number 31. Around 8:45 p.m., they were getting ready to go out.
Okay.
And they suddenly heard knocking outside. They went to check and found Wallace looking, well, perplexed. He immediately asked them if they'd noticed anything strange earlier. He pointed out that he'd tried both his front and back doors with his keys, but they just weren't working. He couldn't get in.
Couldn't get in.
Right. So with his neighbors now standing right there watching, Wallace tried the back door again. And almost like magic, this time the key worked. The door opened.
Just like that.
Just like that. It revealed complete darkness inside. Wallace went in, started lighting the gas lamps. He went upstairs first, checked the bedroom, then came back downstairs. It was then, as he went into his sitting room, that he found Julia, his wife's lifeless body on the floor, right in front of the fireplace.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Blunt force injuries to her head. It was tragically clear that she was well past any help. Okay, so let's try to unpack this crime scene a bit. The initial investigation of the Wallace home, it didn't exactly clear things up. In fact, it probably opened up more questions than answers.
It seems to be a theme here.
Definitely. All things considered, the house wasn't massively disturbed, just a few minor things slightly out of place. It wasn't like it had been ransacked.
And what's really striking, medically and forensically, is the limited blood evidence.
Right.
It was found on Julia's body, of course. And weirdly, some in the bathtub upstairs, but notably, not much elsewhere in the house. And crucially, not on the clothes Wallace himself was wearing that night.
Which seems odd given the violence.
Extremely odd. That cleanliness is a very perplexing detail, given how brutal the attack must have been. It just doesn't fit the typical picture of such a violent crime. And it immediately raises suspicions, you know? How could it be so contained?
And then there's the robbery angle. A cabinet had apparently been broken into, and about 4 pounds were said to be missing from a cash box inside.
4 pounds. Not exactly a huge haul.
No. And beyond that, there wasn't really anything else to suggest a typical robbery gone wrong. No other valuables seemed to be taken.
Seems a bit performative, if it was robbery.
Could be. And even more puzzling, there was the issue of a missing fireplace poker.
Ah, the likely weapon.
That was the theory, yes. Especially given where Julia was found, near the fireplace. But it was never found. Despite really extensive searches of the house, the drains, the whole area, there was a story about an iron bar being found years later during renovations. But the poker, if it was the weapon, and if it even was missing, it's never turned up.
Right, so this forces us to ask, if this wasn't really a robbery, what was the motive? And who on earth was Q? The immediate thought, both back then and even now looking back, is that whoever Q was, they must have been the killer.
And the call was a ploy.
Exactly. A clever trick to get Wallace out of the house. Unless, of course, Q and Wallace were the same person staging this incredibly elaborate alibi.
Well, the court of public opinion, they pretty much decided right away that Wallace was guilty.
Yeah, public opinion can be swift.
To them, he was really the only person who could possibly have had any motive, even if it wasn't clear what that motive was. So that automatically made him the culprit in their eyes. And this widespread belief, it seems it was reflected by the jury. After a 4-day trial, they took only 1 hour.
Just an hour, wow.
Just 1 hour to sentence Wallace to death by hanging. And this was despite, as we said, a real lack of what you call a smoking gun. No direct, irrefutable evidence linking him physically to the crime scene at the time of death.
It's fascinating, though, in the broader legal context, that the judge who presided over the trial strongly disagreed with that jury's quick decision.
Really?
Yeah. He actually reminded them quite forcefully that their civic duty was to find Wallace not guilty unless they were absolutely sure, based strictly on the evidence presented in court, that he had killed Julia. The judge stressed that the specific question for this trial was, did Wallace kill Julia? Not just the broader question of who killed Julia.
That's a subtle but really crucial distinction, isn't it?
It is. It highlights the burden of proof required for a conviction.
So, okay, let's weigh this up. What does it all mean when we look at the arguments for and against Wallace's guilt? A major point for the defense was always that seeming lack of motive. As we said, no stories of affairs, no evidence they'd fallen out of love. Julia was only insured for a pretty small sum, so it wasn't a big financial windfall.
Right, the classic motives just don't seem to fit neatly.
And Wallace himself, he died only a couple of years after Julia in 1933. In that short time, there was no sudden change in his lifestyle, no new wife appearing on the scene. He didn't seem to be someone benefiting from her death.
Of course, it's true that what really goes on behind closed doors, especially in a marriage that's lasted almost 2 decades, well, that's ultimately unknowable, isn't it?
Impossible to know for sure.
But the prosecution, even without a crystal clear motive like money or jealousy, they still built a strong counter-argument, and it all centered around that mysterious phone call from Q. Their theory essentially was, we don't need a perfect motive if we can show he engineered the whole scenario himself.
Okay, so how did they argue that? Well, the prosecution claimed that the call from Q, the one to the chess club, was traced. They said it came from a public phone booth just 400 yards away from the Wallace house.
That close. Wow.
Yes. So their theory was that Wallace could have slipped out of his house around, say, 7.1 footy that evening. He could have walked quickly to the phone booth, reached it by about 7.18 p.m., just in time to make that 7.20 p.m. call that the venue owner received.
And their reasoning was, how else could this supposed stranger, Q, possibly have known Wallace's exact chess club schedule, where he'd be and when?
Right. To the prosecution, this pointed directly at Wallace orchestrating his own alibi, making the call himself.
So the critical question really becomes, how would a genuine stranger, this Q, have known Wallace's schedule and the exact time to call the chess club? The prosecution really hammered this point, suggesting Wallace meticulously planned his airtight alibi with the staged call and the, wild goose chase that followed. It painted a picture of a very cunning, premeditated act.
But the defense, they had some strong rebuttals to this. First off, the venue owner himself, the one who took the call, he claimed it would be a real stretch to believe Wallace made that call.
Because of the voice.
Exactly. He stated quite clearly, in his opinion, that Q's voice sounded nothing like Wallace's voice. And if you consider Q as some other person, some third-party criminal, well, that person could have simply been watching the house. They could have seen Wallace leave, maybe seen him pass near the phone booth.
And taken that as their cue to make the call and set the plan in motion.
Precisely. And as for how Q knew Wallace's schedule, well, it turns out because Wallace was playing in a championship game that night, his name and playing schedule were actually listed on the club's roster.
Which was publicly viewable.
Apparently so. It wasn't exactly secret information.
Okay, that does counter the prosecution's point significantly. But what's really compelling here, I think, is the implication if Q was someone else. That person must have known the Wallaces well enough that they didn't want to be recognized, either by Wallace or potentially by Julia.
Which explains leaving a message instead of calling back.
Exactly. It explains why they'd leave a message with the venue owner rather than risk Wallace being there, or even calling the house earlier when Julia was definitely home. It suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Wallace's routine, maybe even their family situation, someone trying to avoid direct contact.
Okay, now for what might be the absolute crux of the whole case, the most contentious part. Could Wallace have even physically done it?
The timeline.
The timeline. It all comes down to this incredibly tight window. Remember, the prosecution's entire case really rested on that milk boy's testimony. He placed Julia alive at 6:30 p.m. The next definite, undisputed sighting of Wallace is around 7:10 p.m. at a spot that's a good 20-minute journey from his house.
Okay.
So working backwards, that means at the absolute latest, Wallace had to have left his house by 6:50 p.m. to be where he was seen at 7:10 p.m.
Right, so if we just look at that sequence, that leaves a window of only 20 minutes between 6:30 p.m. when Julia was seen alive and 6:50 p.m. when Wallace must have left.
20 minutes.
20 minutes for him to allegedly murder Julia in a brutal fashion, clean himself up meticulously, clean the scene to some extent, remember how little blood there was supposed to be around, and maybe slightly ruffle things to stage a robbery.
It sounds like a lot to do in 20 minutes.
It's a significant stretch, isn't it? It really pushes the boundaries of physical feasibility. Speed is one thing, but that level of meticulous cleanup in such a short, frantic time frame, it seems, well, almost impossible.
A stretch, definitely.
Yeah.
But maybe not completely impossible on its own, perhaps. However, the defense introduced another critical piece of testimony, something that shrank that window even further.
What was that?
While the milk boy insisted he was there at 6:30 p.m., a local paper girl testified differently. She said the milk boy wasn't at Wallace's door at number 29 by the time she finished her delivery next door at number 27, and she claimed she left number 27 around 6:43 p.m.
Okay, so later than the milk boy said.
Significantly later. And a few neighborhood boys seemed to back this up, claiming they saw the paper girl leaving just a few minutes after 6:45 p.m.
Right, now that is fascinating, because the implication there is profound. If Julia was actually still alive around 6:45 p.m.,
which is what the paper girl's timing suggests,
then Wallace's window to commit the murder, do the cleanup, stage the scene, and leave the house. It shrinks from 20 minutes down to just 5 minutes.
5 minutes between roughly 6:45 p.m. and 6:50 p.m.
5 minutes. That doesn't just make his involvement a stretch. It makes it seem utterly physically impossible. It pushes things beyond reasonable feasibility, almost into the realm of mathematical impossibility for one person to achieve all that.
It really does put the prosecution's timeline in serious doubt. Then there's that whole issue with the keys, remember?
Ah, yes, the neighbors finding him outside.
Exactly. Wallace is found by his neighbors outside his house, claiming his key won't work. Not the front door, not the back door. Then the moment his neighbors are there, fully present, watching him, he tries the back door key again.
And presto, it works perfectly fine.
Right, which looks incredibly suspicious, doesn't it?
It certainly does on the surface. Was it a genuine mechanical fault with the lock? Or was it a very calculated performance? An attempt to create a public alibi for his re-entry, making sure he had witnesses to his discovery of the body.
Wallace himself claimed the lock mechanism was faulty, that it would sometimes stick.
But the crucial missing piece here is that the doors and locks were apparently never closely examined forensically at the time.
Really? That seems like a huge oversight.
It does. Without that detailed examination, it just remains an unanswered question. It allows for both interpretations, genuine malfunction or clever staging. We just can't know for sure.
And finally, what about that robbery? Just 4 pounds allegedly taken.
Yeah, we touched on this. It seems odd.
Very odd. Why only 4 pounds if it was a genuine robbery? Surely a thief would take more if they could, or look for more.
But conversely, if Wallace staged it to look like a robbery, why do such a half-hearted job? Why not make it look more convincing? Take more valuables, cause more obvious disarray?
It doesn't quite add up either way.
Exactly. Putting this into perspective, that minimal theft, the almost token nature of it, strongly suggests this was never really just about robbery. When the obvious motive, like theft, seems off or doesn't quite fit the scene, it often signals that there's a deeper, maybe more personal, or perhaps a more meticulously planned agenda behind it all. It shifts your focus from what was taken to what was the real reason for this.
Yeah. This case is just full of those kinds of contradictions.
It really is a classic example of how the details can point in multiple directions at once.
So what happened in the end? What did it all mean for justice? Well, ultimately, Wallace's conviction was overturned. It was quashed by the Court of Criminal Appeal due to insufficient evidence.
Which was a big deal at the time.
A huge deal. It wasn't just a legal victory for Wallace. It was, remarkably, the very first time in English legal history that a conviction for murder had been overturned purely on the grounds of insufficient evidence by the appeal court.
So he walked free in the eyes of the law.
In the eyes of the law, yes. But not really in the court of public opinion. He was still widely believed to be guilty. Apparently, he was harassed quite badly to the point where he actually had to relocate. Life wasn't easy for him afterwards.
I can imagine that kind of public suspicion would be hard to live with.
And he didn't live much longer. Wallace passed away just 2 years after Julia in 1933. Seems he had ongoing health issues. kidney problems mainly. After his death, though, something interesting came out. His private diary entries were made public.
Oh, what did they reveal?
Well, within them, he wrote quite movingly, it seems, about the loss of his wife, remembering her fondly, which you might expect. But what's really intriguing is that he also expressed strong suspicion about someone else, a colleague from Prudential, his insurance company.
He suspected a colleague was the killer.
He seemed to, yes. He suspected this person might have been the actual murderer.
Yeah.
He even wrote about considering hiring a private investigator to follow this person, though he never actually named him in the diary.
Wow. So even Wallace himself had lingering doubts and pointed a finger, albeit privately, at someone specific.
Apparently so.
That's fascinating, because almost a century later, here we are, really no closer to a definitive answer than people in Liverpool were back then. The lack of that smoking gun against Wallace, combined with no obvious verifiable leads pointing clearly to anyone else. It just leaves this case perpetually stuck in the unsolved category.
Yeah.
It really stands as a chilling reminder, doesn't it, of how some mysteries, despite all the investigation and speculation, can simply remain elusive, hidden in the past.
It really does. This case is just such a powerful reminder of how even facts that seem simple on the surface can hide this deeper, maybe impenetrable truth. Leaves you wondering forever, really. Was justice actually served in the end? Or did a very calculated, clever killer manage to walk free, hidden by the very complexity and doubt they might have created? So that's our deep dive into the truly impossible murder of Julia Wallace. It's one of those cases that just continues to baffle, makes you question everything from timing to motive to the very nature of proof itself.
It really does. And it invites us to consider, in today's world with ever-increasing forensic capabilities, DNA technology, advanced legal analysis, what other mysteries from the past, maybe ones just like this, might still eventually see the light of day? Could secrets like these finally be revealed?
That is something profound to think about, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating corners of knowledge.